to my talk. Thank you everyone at the conference for having me. So first, who am I? You know, like an owl. Who? Haha, it's a joke. So yeah, my name is Aaron Turner. I go by Torch2424 on the internet. And I do a lot of things. I'm actually going to explain them in this talk, so I'm going to glaze over some of the names, but I'm part of AssemblyScript, which is that TypeScript-like language we were just seeing in Mitch's talk. I'm the author of WasmBoy, author of WasmByExample. I'm also the author of MadeWithWebAssembly, which is something we won't cover as much, but it's a showcase of projects using WebAssembly, so it's good for like finding ideas, or if you're like, what games are built with WebAssembly? You can just search games and it'll pop up. And I'm currently working at Fastly on their WebAssembly efforts. So like a lot of their like serverless things they've been exploring and stuff that we'll kind of glaze over in this talk as well. So if I'm not mistaken, this is like the last talk of the conference. There's a panel after this, so please don't leave. But I think I'm pretty sure that according to the schedule is the last one. So because of that, I want to do something a little different. I wanted to make it feel more closing-ish. So we'll also have a little story here on top of some of the tech. So first, let's go into the agenda of what we'll be talking about. So just for those that don't possibly know what it is, I know Mitch just gave a whole talk about it. I know a lot of people here coming from an scripting background. We'll do a quick little overview of what AssemblyScript is. And then I wanted to talk about how I got involved with the AssemblyScript project. And this is probably more the story-driven type part with the feels and stuff. Hopefully, y'all don't mind talking about myself. And then we'll go into how you can also get involved with the project as well. So kind of like some random tips that I think might be useful. And lastly, we'll talk about what's up next for AssemblyScript. So where is it headed? Some of the kind of our thinking in the groups and stuff of how it's going to work out. So let's get into it. AssemblyScript is a TypeScript-like language that compiles to WebAssembly. The goal really is that like, if you're a JavaScript or a TypeScript developer, you should be able to read and write AssemblyScript with very, very little learning. So with that, I mean, like, how is it the same? So for example, it has very similar syntax. AssemblyScript is actually even possible to be compiled with a TypeScript compiler. If you do some small tweaks here and there, you can use the TypeScript compiler on AssemblyScript, which is pretty cool. AssemblyScript has a lot of its own tooling that could be uploaded to NPM. So for example, when you want to start using AssemblyScript, you NPM install AssemblyScript, and that'll give you the compiler. It also shares a lot of tools with TypeScript, so like linting and syntax highlighting. We saw Mitch had their own implementation, but if you wanted to, a lot of by default, like the default TypeScript extension inside of VS Code and stuff, it just works out of the box. So it kind of follows the same modern JS workflow. It's kind of the point here is that like if you write JavaScript, it's not a huge leap to start playing with AssemblyScript and like looking at it and reading it and things. But like we mentioned there, it's TypeScript-like. So let's talk about some of the differences. There are some stricter types in AssemblyScript. This is needed by WebAssembly because the primitives like we've gone over are like I32, I64. So in TypeScript, for example, you have a number type, which represents all numbers. But in AssemblyScript, you have your like I32 and I64, float32, so on and so forth. Another thing I want to call out is that you still have the same WebAssembly restrictions, like there's no DOM access yet because it's currently in proposal. And I only bring this up just because when I tell JavaScript developers about AssemblyScript, they're like, oh, cool, I'm going to go compile React to WebAssembly because it's, I wrote it in TypeScript. And it's like, no, that won't work because of like, you have to do some of the typing, but as well as because of some of the limitations of WebAssembly currently. And language is still very young. It's still missing some really big features. For example, closures are still in development and so is regex. So we'll be getting into those deeper and kind of how those are in development. But those are two things that I like to call out to new people looking at AssemblyScript. So here we have is a, what does it look like? Here's a quick implementation of AssemblyScript. It's a small Fibonacci implementation. So if you can read JavaScript/TypeScript, you should be able to read this for the most part. Like, for example, just, you can see it's looping and, there's an if statement and things. The only major difference really between running this in TypeScript or AssemblyScript is that in AssemblyScript, like we mentioned before, it has those I32s. So you would just replace that with number and then you would have a TypeScript that can run through the TypeScript compiler. That's about it. So cool, we know what AssemblyScript is. Let's talk about how I got involved with it. So I was born July 18th in a hospital. Oops, let me go back. And that was a joke that I messed up and misclicked. But so we're not going that far back, but we will start at when I first heard about WebAssembly. At the time, it was my last year of college, and I was doing a ton of like front-end web dev, mostly in AngularJS for like years professionally before this. And I was part of this local code meetup called Code and Coffee Long Beach. And most of us go to Scale, which is Southern California Linux Expo, and we usually walk to this restaurant after. And while we were walking, my close friend David Nguyen was like, hey, dude, there's this new spec coming around. It was pretty cool. And I was like, oh, dude, what's it called? And he was like, it's WebAssembly. Essentially, it's assembly for the web. Name hasn't grown as well as it could have been. But that being said, we talked about it. And, assembly for the web kind of just gave me this click of, oh, native performance in the browser, just kind of this better performance rather than the interpreted JavaScript that we'd had before. And I was extremely stoked on this because performance of JavaScript has always been something I've bumped across whenever I built side projects and other apps here and there. So at the same time, though, I was very skeptical because we know a lot of web standards, they come and go. Most of the time they'll be supported by most of the browsers, but not all of them. And then you get this kind of weird like twilight zone of what browser can you use with X spec. A good example for me, at least, is web components. I know it had strong support in Chrome for a while, but Safari and Firefox took a long time to also implement it due to like just different feelings from each vendor. And at the time, I only saw WebAssembly really being talked about by Google at I/O and Chrome Dev Summit. So I kind of had this feeling that WebAssembly would be this only Chrome thing for a while when I first heard about it. But then in the opening keynote of Chrome Dev Summit 2017, I was watching it, having a good old time. I think I was eating popcorn. They had this dedicated WASM section. And I was like, oh, we're talking about WebAssembly during the keynote? All right. And then they had the slide that was like, hey, look, it's everywhere. The only thing that's left is just Edge. And it's like pretty much going to come out. And I was like, oh, snap. WebAssembly is here. So the first thought I had was like, oh, no, I'm late. And, it's already here. This is so exciting to me. Everyone must already have done everything with it. The programmer elites must have built all the tools, all the applications. It's already done. Every product I've ever used is like halfway done with their WebAssembly implementation. So even though I was wrong about this assumption, but I was like, I got to learn WebAssembly as soon as possible, mostly because I wanted to build it in my side projects and things. So the last time I wanted to learn a new technology for fun was Golang or Go. I got really interested in Go server performance, and I saw a lot of really cool projects popping up made in Go. And I also wanted to learn how to write emulators at the same time because I played them a bunch as a kid, like Super Nintendo on my PC and stuff. It was really fun. So I was like, how about I do this 2 birds, 1 stone project? And ChipGo, which is a chip-8 emulator written in Go, was my first emulator project. The chip-8 is a small virtual machine, I think, from the 80s. It's a very simple instruction set, and you can play games like Breakout and Tic-Tac-Toe on it. So that was a fun little side project of mine. So after that, I was on Reddit looking through r/emudev. I was like, cool, a lot of the rumors there is that chip-8's a great first emulator, but it's only like a half emulator because there's no audio, only about 40-ish opcodes or CPU instructions, and the graphics are extremely simple. So r/emudev was like the next step would either be NES or Game Boy. And I have a lot of nostalgia for the Game Boy because all of my like early gamer memories of me playing in the back of a car. So I was like, that's the one I got to build next. So after, I had my project in mind, I was like, let me pick a language to write. So this is, I think, maybe about like 2017-ish. And I knew Rust, C, and Go, and there was this prototype of this AssemblyScript thing. For me, Rust and C didn't quite seem like good for me because I had like no experience writing system languages. And normally I don't feel as comfortable writing them. So kind of those two I kind of like put on the shelf. And then it came down to Go and AssemblyScript. And I was leaning towards AssemblyScript. The reason being is because AssemblyScript was like this JavaScript and web performance dream come true. I already used a ton of TypeScript from my Angular days, and most of my current tooling would already work. And I wouldn't have to learn both WebAssembly and like a systems level programming language at the same time to like build the thing I wanted to build. But even though, it was like my perfect dream, I still decided to go with Go at the time, actually. I heard a lot of rumors that AssemblyScript was way too young. I had a lot of Go experience from that other emulator. I knew Go had a WASM implementation. So I figured, you know what, that's probably the more mature language. I'll go with that. And I learned a lesson here that I think is still apparent today. When you choose, so I chose Go, and I learned what it meant to like support WASM. So when I started my project, this is like, I think maybe about 2.5 years ago-ish, Go's WebAssembly implementation wasn't in main. It's like mainline branch. So I had to use Nienlance's fork. Nienlance is the person that wrote a lot of the early Go WASM implementation. So huge shout out to them. They did a lot of great work there. But at the time, there was still missing a lot of features from like the WebAssembly implementation compared to Go the language. So this is actually something I just want to call out as well. Since WebAssembly is still really young, a lot of mature languages can still have a lot of like catching up to do on the ecosystem side. So like, for example, not to like say any languages doing better than others, but just something to keep in mind is that whenever you choose a language, choose it for both its maturity, but also what it's doing in WebAssembly, because those don't always translate one-to-one. So at the time, I was kind of playing with Go. I was like, this isn't really working out for me because it's still very young on the Go side, or the Go WASM side. And so I went back to AssemblyScript. I was like, you know what? I think at the time there was just a Hello World example. That's the only resource I had. But I just used the Hello World example, the WasmJS API docs and NPM and the AssemblyScript compiler. And I got stuff working pretty quickly. I was like, oh yeah, this isn't too bad. We're starting some business here. So I started WasmBoy on January 1st of 2018. So we're like halfway. I think I started this project like 2.5 years ago, I think. Well, yeah, January 1st. I don't know. Time is hard. So I started writing the emulator just based on a mix of like technical Game Boy documents, other emulator source code, and this very awesome but very incorrect Game Boy guide by Codeslinger, who I think is based out of London, but it was like written in the 2000s about like how they wrote theirs. And so yeah, there's a thing called AwesomeGBDev if you want to do something like this. But so, I started writing this emulator, and the first thing I came across was that imports weren't working. At first, I was like, imports don't work. I could just write it all in one file. But then around I think 2,000 lines, Adam was like, no, you have to go open a bug because I'm not going to open this file anymore. So open this issue in AssemblyScript. And it ended up being just user error. And I got some help from Decode, who you'll see on the thing. They're the author of AssemblyScript, like one of the originals. So just opening issues, they would either be user error or it would be a legitimate bug. They would let me know, and there was no docs, so it was kind of just us talking back and forth. And from this, I found a lot of the early issues on AssemblyScript, and we quickly became just online friends from just talking and working on emulator stuff and about AssemblyScript. But to be honest, I probably had more trouble writing the emulator than I did just using AssemblyScript, because writing an emulator is like really, really, really hard. And I think WasmBoy still is like the toughest thing I ever worked on anything ever. But there is somewhat of this like general emulator development community. So I reached out for some help. And there was this bug I had where I was like, if I can't figure out this bug, I don't know if I could do this emulator because this is getting ridiculous. But thankfully, a helpful Redditor who also wrote an emulator helped me out. They showed me how to use existing emulators to trace my CPU instructions and opcodes. And from that, they were also kind enough to read more source code. And they were like, hey, look, you're using a 16-bit store instead of an 8-bit one. And I know I checked through that source code so many times, but when you write 255 CPU instructions with each having their own unique switch case, something slipped through. So I was glad to get some help there. And yeah, this Redditor's name was BenjiMint, and Benji had already heard about WebAssembly, and they mentioned, that's cool, you're using WebAssembly. And I was like, DM'd him, and I was like, dude, how do you know about WebAssembly? I've only talked to people online about WebAssembly. And then come to find out, they work at the Google, at the time they still work at Google on the WASM team. And they wrote their own emulator in Emscripten that compiles the WebAssembly. And this person is actually Ben Smith. Funny enough, BenjiMint is them. And they're one of the panelists after this talk. And now Ben and I are like in real life friends that like grab lunch on the weekends and stuff. But yeah, we met on Reddit first. And then in person, we started hanging out when we lived near each other. And now we're friends in WebAssembly. And we're both speaking at the same conference. So I think that's a funny story I wanted to call out real quick. But from all this, WasmBoy became a really neat project. Some people that I looked up to really started to take notice of it and retweeting it. It's like, oh my God. And it became a good project to point out for WebAssembly potential, especially in the context of the browser, because I was using a lot of like service workers and web workers to make it a really solid PWA with really good performance. So from like a web performance standpoint, it became a good place to point out for both WebAssembly and just general applications on the web. So, and in some sense, I kind of like to think, or I've seen people tell me that they feel like WASM would kind of prove the idea of AssemblyScript. Vladimir is a friend of mine working at Near, and they mentioned publicly that the project showed Near that AssemblyScript to them was ready to start being built on top of. And I think it did that for a lot of people just interested in WebAssembly in general, because it was this application they could use and see like, oh, this is built with WebAssembly and it's doing this cool thing. I think this is ready now for X, Y, and Z. So that was really exciting. So as another quick side note, after college, I joined the AMP team at Google. And from this, I moved to Los Angeles or Long Beach, where I currently am, to Silicon Valley. And I mentioned this just because, from that, they had a whole WASM team at Google. So Google's this really big place, but I was able to sneak my way in and hang out with all of them. And I got to, for the first time, meet other people that were in real life that knew WebAssembly and worked in it. So we all quickly became WebAssembly friends, I guess. And this is super trippy for me, this screenshot that I'm showing currently, because this is my buddy Thomas. The last name is Neistat. I hope I pronounced that right. But we first met at SF HTML5, which is like a web meetup in like San Francisco. I was hanging out with Ben, and then they were like, hey, look, that's cool. You're giving a talk. You're the project manager of WASM at Google. And they're like, yeah, I'm going to show off some demos in the beginning. And I was like, oh, cool. What are the demos? And they were like, oh, yeah, this and that and WasmBoy. And I was like, dude, I wrote WasmBoy. You're going to show it off? Wow. So it was this cool, trippy moment. And then people were really stoked on the demo. So it was cool that like for the first time I met someone who did WebAssembly stuff was already like, dude, that's the cool thing you built. I put it in my talk. So it was fun. And this actually just meeting the Google WASM team was really helpful because at the time, AssemblyScript had manual memory management. We now have a runtime, but at the time we kind of just still did things manually with allocators and things. The reason being is because we were waiting on the GC proposal. So being able to talk to Googlers and say, hey, how's that GC proposal coming along? And they were like, well, honestly, we're kind of more focused on threads right now. That was, things I can relate back to the AssemblyScript team and be like, hey, you know what, maybe it is worth investing in like just an MVP runtime. That way, while the garbage collection proposal makes its way through, we have something for new people adopting the language. So that was extremely helpful in what we actually did. And from that too, now we kind of got to maybe be a part of the conversation with some of the bigger players pushing the spec and things. And that's kind of the point where it started, I feel like. So, I'm running out of breath. All right, I'm talking too much. Another awesome meetup I went to was WebAssembly SF. And if I'm not mistaken, this was the first WebAssembly focused meetup. So in there, I got to meet a lot of my current friends for the first time. For example, like Jonathan Barry, they run WebAssembly SF, and they were just mentioned in previous talk, the WASM 3 talk. Tyler McMullen, who is the CTO of Fastly, and we now are colleagues. We work together. Lynn Clark and Till Schrenwright. Till, I'm sorry if I said your last name wrong, but yeah, from that, I just became a regular at the meetup. I got to meet so many cool people. And it was a really small, tight-knit group of people who all knew WebAssembly really well. And it was just really exciting for all of us to get together and share. Like, oh, this thing is so cool. There's so much potential here. And it was at this point that I realized WebAssembly is like actually kind of small, or like not small, but really early from an application user standpoint. Like it had been in development for like a couple of years before I had gotten involved. But I just kind of realized for like an end user, there's still so much growth and potential for it. And I think that's still true today. So I just kind of learned that once I was, oh no, I'm late. That's the part where I was wrong. I was actually extremely early from like in terms of building things with it. So that just made me even more excited and motivated about WebAssembly. So from that too, I also got invited to speak at WebAssembly SF, which I was super surprised by. And I think this might be one of the first like AssemblyScript focused talks that I've seen, or like I saw on YouTube at least. So I was really excited to give that. And it was also a really cool way to highlight the web performance thing I mentioned about the web workers and how I architected it with WebAssembly to give people kind of like first steps into it. And in general, I made the talk targeted towards JavaScript developers. So that was really helpful in terms of showing off like, hey, AssemblyScript is great for this group of people that maybe feel like they're being left behind by these scripting flags and things. What was I going to say? It was also tweeted out by, like I said, working at Google, had a bunch of friends on the V8 team, and they were like, dude, that was a cool talk. And they tweeted it out on the V8 account, and they got retweeted by a bunch of people that do cool things, like Brendan Knight, the creator of JavaScript. So I was like, whoa, that's wild. So after that, like I mentioned, the V8 team was like, dude, you're doing cool stuff. They put me as 20% under V8, doing like kind of like some DevRel stuff. And I was doing all this WebAssembly in my free time through the 20% thing. And at the time, there wasn't a WASM DevRel at Google yet. I know Ingvar is doing a great job now. But I like to think that I got to help in that role in some ways when WebAssembly was first starting to come around. So I was really excited to be a part of that in some way, shape, or form. It was also super surreal to be highlighted by Surma at Google I/O back in the day for me, because I was like, dude, like this is wild. And then just to see so many people getting interested in WebAssembly and AssemblyScript, and yeah, it was just wild. So as a 20%er, I built a lot of new cool stuff. Shout out to Matthias Beinens for helping me out, if I said their last name correctly. I also wrote an article on benchmarking AssemblyScript versus ES6 at the time, or JavaScript, where what I did, like I mentioned earlier, I took WasmBoy, ran it through both the AssemblyScript compiler and the TypeScript compiler to get WebAssembly and JavaScript out. That way you can benchmark the two using an actual web application rather than just like micro-benching Fibonacci against the two. And I think what this benchmark proved is that it's actually worth writing WebAssembly over TypeScript and JavaScript. There is a significant performance gain to be had. And if you already write JavaScript, AssemblyScript is a great way to get those performance gains if you're new to WebAssembly and want to get started with it. And I also built WasmByExample, which is a popular learning tool, I like to think, for a lot of people, because at least whenever I go to WebAssembly conferences, they're like, dude, I use WebAssembly by example. And I'm like, oh, wow, that's cool. But it's pretty much just a bunch of bite-sized snippets to help get started with WebAssembly. And it averages around like 7,000 visitors a month. So I'm super excited about that. There's a lot of people that are getting interested in starting to look at WebAssembly, and it's been cool to see like the interest of WebAssembly grow through the website. And I had a ton of input on both of these projects from people at WebAssembly people at Google, the AssemblyScript team. They've helped out a ton, and even some of the Rust WebAssembly team. I have Rust support on WasmByExample, or at least I show examples from Rust, and they came and helped out write those examples and things. So I appreciate their time for that. And speaking of Rust, I think I met some of my first Rust WASM friends at like JSConf.eu 2019. We quickly became friends. Ashley Williams, Steve Klabnik, and Ryan Levick. Once we met, we're like, dude, WebAssembly is cool. And one thing that I like to mention, at least, it was a wild moment for me, is Ashley was like, are you Aaron Turner? And I was like, yeah, how do you know my name? And they were like, dude, you built WasmBoy, and it was like so cool, and thank you so much for building it. And I was like, whoa, what? That's like a wild moment. And then we quickly became friends after that. But I guess it had somehow made the rounds around the Rust WASM community as well, and they saw it also as like a good project to highlight for like cool things you can do with WebAssembly. So from that, I just started participating in the Rust WASM meetings and helping out there where I could, and kind of just participating with that. And the picture I'm showing is from RustConf 2019. I don't know why I look so upset. I think it was I don't know, but I was having a great time, I promise you. But yeah, Ashley Williams taught the Rust WASM workshop, and Ryan Levick and we helped out as like teacher assistants. And they're awesome people. I cannot sing the praises about them enough. And at this point, AssemblyScript was still just a GitHub repo with a Slack channel where you can like ask us questions and stuff. But I got some really solid advice from two people, one being Christopher Baxter. We worked together on the AMP team, and they told me the importance of having a team on a project in open source as the project scales. And Nick Fitzgerald on the Rust WASM side of things helped me a ton in explaining the Rust process for Rust and WASM, what they do. So with that knowledge, I started looking into this, building a governance for the team, and we created this new meta repo because it's a project about a project, pretty much so meta, where a lot of the active maintainers, we started chatting about options for governance, and then we chose a structure that worked for us. And probably the latest thing I'm really stoked on is I got to help organize the first WebAssembly conference. I got to be an organizer for WASM Summit, which is, I think, the first WebAssembly conference. Surma and Thomas Trankler started the initial plan, and we ended up having a really sizable org team, but just some of the notable people would be Ashley Williams and myself. This is the first time, I think, where most of the WASM community got to meet up with each other IRL. There's been a lot of pockets per tool chain or location and things, but for the first time, we all get to meet up, and that was really cool to see the knowledge share and everyone having a great time. And on the organizing team, I kind of got to be the AssemblyScript representation. So that was really fun to be able to give input from an AssemblyScript point of view when we chose talks and things. And one talk I want to highlight, since the AssemblyScript talk, is Peter Solomon. They did this amazing recompiling synth thing that they built in AssemblyScript, and it was an awesome music demo, and it was really fun, and a lot of people really liked it, and I thought it was a great highlight of AssemblyScript and WebAssembly in general, honestly. And these days, after Google, I had joined Wasmer, and now I work at Fastly, and I most recently wrote an article for Fastly about how Fastly is exploring and investing in different WebAssembly languages for their new platform, and AssemblyScript is one of them, and we're starting to dabble in other languages as well. And I told you this whole story because I just want to share here that I kind of got involved in WASM because a lot of awesome people are building this very welcoming community. There are a lot of people and organizations that see a lot of potential in WebAssembly, and they are all genuinely very kind. And we all know that we can build WebAssembly the best as it can be if we all work together at it. I cannot express enough how grateful I am to everyone that I've already mentioned in this story. And the point of this is that if you have an organization that wants to assign someone to work on some WebAssembly stuff, and they're like a kind person, they're going to find a community that that will also welcome them, be kind to them, and they can make a great impact and have a great time doing it. Even if they have no WebAssembly experience, they happen to be just some random Angular developer finishing up college in Long Beach like I was. So now that we mentioned how I got involved, how could you get involved, or how can your organization get involved? Again, I'd like to just echo, anyone can get involved, no matter what your background or skill is. There's definitely something you can help with. For example, I think AssemblyScript is very much a grassroots project. We're a group of people that just thought WebAssembly could do cool stuff and felt like creating a path for the modern front-end web was important for that. So I just want to highlight some of the team members, not all of them, but like some of the, maybe some of the more earlier ones and things. So speaking of earlier ones, Decode.io is their handle, but they're the original author of AssemblyScript. They're based out of Germany. And they explained to me that they got into WebAssembly because they have this game called Creep TD, which is like this really hardcore tower defense game. And I think it was a Java applet. So when they tried to port it to the web, it just wasn't performing the way they needed it to. So they saw WebAssembly, this new spec that was coming up, and they were like, oh, you know, I should help with that WebAssembly thing because then I could port my game. And 3 years later, they're still working on the WebAssembly thing instead of the game. But, you know, I think it all worked out for the best. So Max Gray is another person, a part of the team. They're one of the co-authors of AssemblyScript. They're based out of Ukraine. They come from a background of visualizations and their like studies. But after I think they're done with school, they had a really notable career in contracting with React, Cordova, and OpenCV, and et cetera. And they worked with Decode on one of the projects that inspired AssemblyScript, which was called TurboScript. It was a similar-ish idea of like a TypeScript-like syntax that compiled to WebAssembly. So then they broke off and ended up doing AssemblyScript stuff. Next, I want to highlight Jay Tenner, or Josh. They created Aspect, which we saw in the previous talk. They're based out of the East Coast, and they're currently just a one-man dev team working for this like dental organization. And they just got involved in AssemblyScript in their free time. They just saw it as a really fun project to be a part of, and they're really passionate about testing. So when they saw there was a need for testing in AssemblyScript, they started creating Aspect. And we'll cover Aspect in a little bit more detail in a little bit. And then Willem Niels, their GitHub alias or whatever the right word is for it. But they currently work at Near doing a lot of their AssemblyScript efforts. And they're based out of the East Coast. I want to say a different part of the East Coast compared to Josh, but I only mention the locations just so you can see how distributed we are. But, they first got involved in AssemblyScript or WebAssembly as well. Because when they were in their graduate degree and they were pursuing that, there was actually a class at their university that they helped out with that was going to teach WebAssembly as a school class for the computer science majors to take. And they used AssemblyScript as their language for the new students because they felt like it was really easy to pick up. And this got us a lot of early feedback from them writing like lesson plans and stuff of just like, hey, this bug is broken and we're going to have students use it. So we'll let you know if they like it or not. So from that, we established anyone can help, no matter what location you are, no matter where you are in the globe, or like what you know already. But I also want to highlight that building the ecosystem is just as important as building the compiler or the thing that we're all building on top of. So I want to highlight what a contribution can be. Cool. So like we mentioned, Jay Tenner built Aspect. And this is now a critical point, I think, in making AssemblyScript production ready. It is a really solid unit testing library that they made on their own personal account. And I think it still sits under Jay Tenner rather than AssemblyScript. But it's a really solid testing framework. It's what we point to all the time when people ask about testing. And it has a just like API, which makes it even continues the ease of use for like JavaScript-based developers. And the point here is that making tools can be super helpful for the project. ASWASI is a WASI implementation by JustIt1. That's their handle. Their name is Frank Dennis. They're a colleague of mine at Fastly. And they also happen to be the creator of Libsodium for the crypto folks out there. ASWASI sits on the same API layers like Node, for example, but for AssemblyScript. So like I think in Node you have FS for file system, but in ASWASI it's called file system, just written out. And this is really helpful for people trying WASI for the first time. It also became the go-to way for writing WASI apps for AssemblyScript. And it helped AssemblyScript, I think, stay current over, to keep up with other WASM implementations. And the point I want to make here is that small personal libraries to like do the same implementation or like keep up with the implementation, whatever it may be, just small libraries are really helpful because I'm sure someone out there is going to want to use that library, and it helps just grow the ecosystem for whatever language you're building. Maybe not as an exciting one, but another one that's really helpful is docs. First, I'll highlight there's a new snippets section on AS Docs. Amongst the team, we have a handful of common patterns we use just because the language is young. So, for example, note checking on a pointer. It's not something that's like going to be not as prevalent, but like in the meantime, we've had this like little snippet of code we've been sharing around, and I was like, hey, we should throw that on the doc somewhere. So if you have any good copy pastable patterns when you use AssemblyScript, you can now share them with the whole community on the docs page. Just open a PR and like you can get started with that. And WasmByExample is another great place. You can add an example there It's super helpful because it'll give more perspectives than just mine, because I only know how to write examples from what I know. I mean, I also think new examples highlight new use cases. Like, for example, I have a graphics and an audio example to show, hey, WebAssembly is good at these things. But if there's something that you like to do that isn't those things, having an example there just helps when people are searching or just looking for, like, what can I do with this thing? So yeah. Lastly, I think a good general rule in open source that isn't maybe spoken about enough is that contributions don't even have to be code. Talks are a ton of help. Like we just saw Mitch Tinson's talk about their WebAssembly efforts at AssemblyScript. This is super helpful for letting people know, hey, this is like, we're using AssemblyScript. These are the things we're coming up against, but these are the things we're winning with AssemblyScript or WebAssembly in general. It's inspires a lot of new novel solutions for people in the crowd of like, oh, I could use WebAssembly for that, nice, or spin off and think of a new idea. But it just helps spread like the awareness of like, these are the things you can do, and like it's working out well for us. So thank you. Another thing that's really great are blog posts. Tyler Fapone, I hope I said their last name right, they recently made a blog post about using AssemblyScript with React. They built a library that helps with the JavaScript WebAssembly interop, so like passing memory and stuff, but specifically with React hooks and how React hooks can work with AssemblyScript a lot easier. This blog post expresses what their library is and like how you can use it, but as well as how they built it, so other people can understand how passing memory and things work if you don't want to use their library and you want to build your own or your own implementation. And again, this is super, super helpful because, when someone searches AssemblyScript and React, they're going to find this blog post and go, oh, wow, that was a really good solution. That I'm glad they work together so well. And here's some really good strategies that I can use, or just use the library if I need to. And like I said, this is really helpful for the project. And another super random thing is that we want a swag shop. I should be giving this talk in an AssemblyScript shirt, but instead I'm just wearing something else. It's just all because we don't have a swag shop yet. So we can't like order stuff for the team. So like I said, we kind of want to wear merch at like talks and events we go to and things. So we've been working on making a shop, and I found out that's actually not easy. Evaluating print on demand shops like Wise, Threadless, or Teespring better than one over the other, or taxes. Taxes is really hard, especially when some of the team is based in the EU, but then the swag shops are based in the US, and like, how does that work? So we finally have a plan there. We just need to upload the design, so that's like almost there. I just gotta like click the open shop button essentially at this point. But stuff like that. Like if there's something that's like has nothing to do with code, but like is helpful, that's a really good example of that. And we'd also really like to hear opinions in the weekly meetings. So we have a community group and a working group. The community group is more focused on like maybe organizational needs, and the working group is more about internal implementation. But if your team is using AssemblyScript, it's like, just letting us know you use AssemblyScript, how AssemblyScript has helped you or hasn't helped you so we can fix it. Or is, if it is helpful, what can we do to keep making it helpful or improve the helpfulness is instrumental in us building the thing and understanding what people are doing. Or even if you're just interested, just letting us know, hey, we're interested. We want to like hang out and see what y'all talk about. This helps us plan and think about where we're going to go in the future. So that's really instrumental in helping us out. And then I want to say sponsoring is also a great way to support the project in general. Sponsoring won't prioritize your issues or PRs to get them merged faster, but what it does do, it keeps the project maintainable. Your dependencies, especially the big ones, you probably want maintained. That way they won't break, or if there's a security issue, they'll be fixed. And I think this just makes a larger impact on the project itself, because then you get people who are really intimately familiar with the project that can start to dedicate more and more of their time towards like fixing bugs and things. So sometimes I would like to argue that maybe it's more productive to like sponsor the project than dedicated engineer to like have to understand the entire AssemblyScript compiler to fix that one thing, rather than it, having just like decode, like, look at it and like, oh yeah, I know that's in like line whatever, just off the top of their head, because they work on the project so often. And I also think sponsoring is going to be really instrumental for us as well, because I think it's going to be more important going forward that we start maybe to have team meetings in person, even though we're so distributed, because a lot of critical planning, or when it's safe, of course, but a lot of critical planning, I think, is a lot better when you whiteboard it out for a lot of architecture type things. And I think it's also going to be instrumental in just growing the general ecosystem. We can send team members to talks and events or whatever it may be. And a good example of this is that I met Mitch and Duncan, who I'm going to mention a little bit, or Mitch Dickinson from the previous talk at WASM Summit. I had to go there on my own dime, but like, it would be cool if we could start flying people out to say, hey, look, like even if you can't afford it, like we got you, don't worry about it. And then, from there we can start to build these relationships with different people that want to use AssemblyScript. So lastly, let's get a little technical. What's next for AssemblyScript? So currently, AssemblyScript has a very minimal runtime. It's super small and removable actually with CLI flags. But the current runtime implementation is mostly just for counting references. It's really just an MVP. The reason why it is an MVP is because, like we mentioned earlier, we kind of still want to swap it out for that WasmGC proposal. So I'm not directly involved with the proposal. A lot of team members watch a lot more closely than I do. But if I understand correctly, the GC proposal has kind of been on the back burner for a little while now, but there's a lot of new momentum getting it merged and kind of a lot of discussion there. So Decode is very active in staying up to date with it with the proposal, and they've been helping out a lot. So we're watching that closely to see where the future of the runtime is going to be. Next, AssemblyScript tries to and is continuing to stay up to date with the WASM spec. When WASIF was first announced, I think the AS had an implementation maybe like a few days later. Yeah, just kind of give an example there. And there's currently a lot of movement on the AnyRef proposal. It's now called XTernRef, but thankfully, due to some contributions from Jay Phelps, who just spoke like not too long ago about the toy languages, they helped open this PR and like rename AnyRef to XTernRef to keep up with the spec. So that's really awesome. And now we're following a new interface, and we're able to keep up to date through the help of like everyone being a part of like the community. And like we mentioned earlier, a major missing and upcoming feature for AssemblyScript is closures. Just as a quick primer for those that maybe don't know what closures is off the top of their head, this is a very bad TLDR, but a closure kind of represents the variable outside of a function and the ability to modify and like write them back from within an inner function. So that's my terrible TLDR. Don't quote me on that, please. But we've seen a ton of investment from Duncan. Their last name was like Uzakia. I don't want to try. It's really I have a hard time with it just because I never spoke with them in person. But yeah, Duncan from Shopify, I will just say, Duncan and I, and mostly Duncan, has been planning and implementing closures for AssemblyScript. And they had a really good MVP implementation of closures. Some of the tests were broken, but it was working for the most part, and Shopify was doing a lot of really great internal testing on it. But in between that, AssemblyScript moved over to first-class functions, which is kind of like you can think of as like functions as objects. It's the TLDR of it. So since the old implementation was kind of in a funny state, we're currently going back and rebasing the old implementation on top of first-class functions. There was like a more advanced plan than just rebasing, but this is like kind of the direction we're heading right now. And we think this will make the closures a lot easier because functions are now represented in memory. So storing and reapplying those locals should be a lot easier. We don't have to do any funny tricks anymore. So we're really looking forward to that. And huge thank you to Duncan for all that work. Next big topic is regex. As you can see here, the current implementation of regex is just like, regex? Nah, we're throwing an error. And this is just because no one's taken the time to do it yet. Because unbeknownst to me, and I learned from starting to play with regex, it's really, 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 really hard. And I didn't know that. So I started it actually. So the first thing I thought was like, okay, cool. What can I do just as a quick solution to get something in there in the meantime? So I kind of thought maybe we can port it from another engine. So QuickJS is this JavaScript engine that's written by Fabrice Bollard. It's really focused on like just being really small, and it has its own ES 2020 regex engine. So I was like, super small, shouldn't be too bad to port. And I was about like maybe 1,000 lines in, and I was like, oh no, this is way harder than I thought because it's doing a lot of like C pointer magic and stuff. And I was like, how do I represent that in AssemblyScript? And then after a while, I started thinking, well, like if I'm having a hard time porting it, it's probably gonna be twice as hard to maintain it. So started looking at other options there. So next we started to look into how we can maybe link the QuickJS regex implementation into an AssemblyScript module. And by link, really my idea was let's just take all the WAT from QuickJS and just inject it into some AS WAT and then try to recompile it from WAT, and then hopefully it'll work. And I thought it wouldn't be too bad, and I think it might actually work, maybe. But the place where it gets funny is that QuickJS, the way it's managing memory, it's not going to know about how AssemblyScript is managing memory and vice versa. So they can start to write over one another when you're doing regex stuff. So this is kind of like the sticking point of that idea. And other team members weren't too happy with it because then it's like, hey, look, like then we have to maintain the C code in the AssemblyScript repo. That's kind of funny. But maybe it's a possible option. We'll see. And then since we're kind of on the this path to build an ES 2020 regex engine, Frank Dennis and I came across this thread that like the TLDR explains that like regex in the browser tends to not follow the spec exactly. Like it has a bunch of other things that go on. And Chrome and Firefox share the same implementation because it is kind of more complex, and like they have to work together on regex because it has grown into this complex thing. So I feel like no matter what decision we make, there's also some other important decisions to make in terms of like, what should regex be in AssemblyScript? Should it be compatible with the spec, or should it be compatible with the browser? You know, which regex should we say that's the regex that is the right regex, and that's the regex you can port over that wouldn't be too bad from other JavaScript projects? Or maybe we should just say, you know what, let's just implement our own regex from scratch, which isn't too preferable because we really want people to just be able to copy and paste their JavaScript regex and run it in AssemblyScript. But then in this case, we have more control of like the implementation. We can say, hey, look, you know, like we got like a very MVP regex, backtracking maybe not supported yet, but it's going to be coming. And that way people can start playing with it earlier rather than just like dumping it all at once. Or, you know, another idea we've had is maybe regex should be proposed for WASI. Maybe it would be good for other languages that might be popping up to have just a shared WASI regex that then all WebAssembly languages can choose to use the one provided by WASI or the WASM spec or whatever it may be. So, you know, there's a lot of open-ended questions there. And regex right now is being investigated by Max Gray, who I mentioned earlier. So next, let's talk JS interop. By interop, I mean like passing AssemblyScript types to JavaScript and vice versa. This would all be easier later on with the interface steps proposal, but for now, we still have to do current other things to get around that. So one of those things is AssemblyScript offers the loader, which is like, I think the GitHub repo is AssemblyScript/loader. And this is a library for passing types over the WASM linear memory boundary between AssemblyScript and JavaScript. The loader is a little bit more lower level. So I built a tool called ASBind, which essentially just uses a loader for you at runtime, makes it a little bit easier. But it does some smart type caching to make the performance loss at runtime a little bit less, because you can kind of assume that like if you call this WebAssembly function once and it took a string, it's probably going to take a string every single time after that, unless it's doing some self-modification of the WebAssembly module. Which is very, very, very rare. It's something you could turn off too if that was the case. But realistically, what we want to do is generate glue code, very similar to what WasmByExample does. For example, when you export a function externally in AssemblyScript, it should also generate the accompanying JavaScript to go with that external function that's exported in WebAssembly. And this is something that's currently being researched by Max Gray to see if we can start generating our bindings rather than trying to do them at runtime. Another hot topic here is AssemblyScript's file extension, funny enough. Currently, AssemblyScript uses .ts. That way, TypeScript tools work out of the box, like the TypeScript compiler, the linter, things like that. To change this file extension, we have to do a couple of things. We'd probably have to rebuild a lot of the TypeScript tooling that we're currently piggybacking off of for the specific AS use case, or the specific AS file extension. And then we'd also have to get tools like GitHub to recognize AssemblyScript as its own language. So that way, when someone runs an AssemblyScript project, it doesn't say TypeScript, it says AssemblyScript. And there's a super long thread we have on, like, I think the working group repo with a lot of interesting points. And one of my favorites actually is that you would immediately think, oh, AssemblyScript, it should be .as. But brought up by Jay Phelps, .as is ActionScript, which is another popular web language from back in the day. And ActionScript, you know, Flash is supposed to be, I think, deprecated at the end of this year. But, you know, it might be still used in some places. There's a lot of, like, revitalization of Flash games, and there's a whole community there. And it is a popular web language from back in the day. So should we knowingly conflict with another language on the web? You know what I mean? So there's an interesting discussion going on there. And like I mentioned just now, AS is piggybacking on a lot of TypeScript tooling. When I say AS, I mean AssemblyScript. I'm sorry. I'm just so he's just talking about AssemblyScript and saying AS from now between the team. But however, there is a lot of movement on AssemblyScript tooling. Like Mitch had mentioned, Saul Cabrera from Shopify, they've been playing around with the language server. And I don't know the repo off the top of my head, but if you join the AssemblyScript Discord on the repo, we can help you out and help you find it. But this is going to be super helpful for like linting, compilation errors specific to AssemblyScript, as well as possible editor extensions like Vim and VS Code whenever they decide to or feel like bringing it over and exposing it, or it already is on GitHub. But yeah, you get what I'm trying to say. So from this, just one more general rule I'm going to express. This is just, you know, as we're talking about tooling and piggybacking and things like that on TypeScript and AssemblyScript, kind of a rule that isn't written down yet, but something we've been talking about in the working group and kind of agreed upon is that we really want to follow TypeScript as close as possible going forward. So like, you know, if TypeScript does some new language feature, we should probably support it in terms of syntax and things, and trying to preserve that backwards compatibility as much as we can. There's always going to be some small tweaks that are needed, or small tweaks, my bad, I misspoke. But there's always going to be some small tweaks, but trying to preserve that would be really helpful. But in case of a conflict, we're going to do what's best for the language in general. That's going to do whatever is the best for performance and user experience. For example, triple equals isn't really needed in AssemblyScript because we have strict types. So what we're probably going to do with triple equals is make it do pointer comparison instead, rather than trying to build some standard library function to do that for you. It would make more sense if it was just in the language as like a syntax thing. So, we're starting to, yeah, my bad. I'm like, look at the time, like, oh no, I got 2 minutes left, let's do it. So from the governance side, we're going to have decode of the BDFL, the project, for a while, looking forward. And we are open to adding new members to the team. For example, Duncan was like, hey, I'm making a lot of big changes to the project. Is it cool if I join the team? And we're like, yeah, of course. You've been helping out a ton. We're happy to have you. We're continuing the working group meetings. Like I mentioned earlier, we're doing those. They've been going great. I think we're on meeting number 20 now, which is exciting. As well as we're having Willem lead the community group meetings, like I mentioned before, for those more focused, like organizational, like, hey, our company's using AssemblyScript for X, Y, and Z. Can you help us with X, Y, and Z? And we can talk to them directly there. And we'd be more than happy to have more maintainers. I gave the whole story about how anyone can contribute. And so if you want to start contributing to AssemblyScript, please feel free. And I saved the best for last. When is AssemblyScript going to be 1.0? Honestly, it's not something we talk about a lot amongst the team. But I thought it'd be worth mentioning here because it's something that a lot of people might be worried about, of like, oh, is AssemblyScript production ready? It's not even 1.0 yet. So I want to just maybe talk about what's going on there in our heads at least. So I asked the working group before this talk of like, hey, what do you think would take AssemblyScript to go 1.0? And Decode, the author, mentioned that they'd prefer for the WasmGC proposal to be merged first because, like we mentioned, that runtime is just an MVP. So if there is no GC, though, if we decide to go 1.0 earlier, we'd probably want to invest more time into making the runtime a lot more solid. We'd also like to see regex because that's a real big sticking point for a lot of people. And we want to be a little bit more confident in our interoperability. So having that binding generator, if possible. Talking to Max Gray, who also works on the compiler a ton, co-author, they said they'd like to see more standard library investment, such as general standard library tooling and things. But as well as multi-value support, which is another proposal of returning multiple values from WebAssembly, because this will cause some big internal changes to AssemblyScript. And we'd rather do those changes first before we say, hey, it's 1.0 now. That way we don't have to try to fix the background before we do that. And then lastly, on my point of view, I think closures and regex are the last two big major adoption points that we want to get fixed. And then I would say, let's start thinking about doing that 1.0. So in general, 1.0 is still being decided, needs a lot of work. And we could definitely use the help building it. So if you're excited about AssemblyScript after watching this talk, please, help us get there. So that was a lot, and let's wrap things up because I think I'm slightly over time, but 2 slides left. Anyone can get involved in AssemblyScript. These are my big points. I would normally say take a picture of the slides, but we're all virtual, so screenshot or whatever you may want to do. But anyone can get involved, even if you're like a 5th-year college student who doesn't have any WebAssembly experience. Please feel free to start contributing. And your contributions don't even have to be code. I feel like I made a pretty big impact on AssemblyScript. I hope I'm not talking about myself too much. I try to stay humble, but I honestly didn't do my first compiler contribution until about a month ago, like the first one that's actually worth mentioning. So talks, blogs, sponsorships, or just building cool projects, they help a ton for AssemblyScript, WebAssembly, or whatever open source thing you're wanting to help out with. Another thing, closure and regex are on the way. Like I said, they're the last big sticking points of the language, and I'm excited to see those get out. And 1.0 will come. It's still a little while out, but we're working really hard on it, and your organization can help us get there. So thank you very much to the WebAssembly community. I feel like I've mentioned a ton of people already, but there are many more in the community I would like to thank, but we're at the end now. I also want to thank my team at Fastly for reviewing my slides, Katie, Adam, Pat, Tanya, Andy, Tyler, and Aaron. There's 2 Aarons on the team, so we have 2, the Aaron joke, we get that twice, double, whatever. But really happy to get to work with them every day. Thank you for the conference organizers for having me. Thank you for watching. And please reach out to me over Twitter. Let's continue this discussion. Join the AssemblyScript Discord. We can continue the discussion there. And thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the conference.